and we had to get vaccinated, and I got the shot that gives you a little more of a hangover than the Pfizer. I did Moderna. So anyway, thank you for the gift that keeps on giving. Hopefully we're getting to the end of this COVID situation. We can start dealing with the bilateral relationship without the muddying of the water from this crazy pandemic that occurred. I don't think we're ever going to get to the bottom of what exactly happened. I think the WHO report said that. I think we talked about it until we were blue in the face last time we got on 8 days ago. Since then, a lot of other news. So I'd rather not focus on COVID. It's just going to make me realize how achy my back and joints are right now.
Real quick. One of the things I've wondered about, you talked about the naming of COVID-19, and there's earlier it was called the Wuhan and the China virus, and then obviously that got politicized and it kind of went off the rails, and everyone calls it COVID-19. I don't really care. COVID-19 is fine with me. One of the things I've wondered about though, Chris, is that you're hearing now we have the South African variant, and I wonder how long before we get to a spot to where that's going to be controversial, because South Africa is a place that's near and dear to my heart. I got a lot of friends down there. And this caught me that it's like, everyone's calling this the South African variant. It's like, well, just a simple question. Are we able to call it the South African variant because they don't have the control like China does? Is there more to it than maybe we've thought about? I mean, so if you take the Trump angle out of it, why can we call this the South African variant? Because that would seem to be just as bad as calling it the China virus or the Wuhan flu or whatever.
Here's my feeling is that we have big issues to deal with. In fact, I'm well over midway through Josh Rogan's book. I'm loving it. I want to talk a lot about it today, not in terms of what's actually in the book per se, although I will rave about it because I do think it's really interesting and it covers a lot of the stuff that I covered in my book. And it sort of makes me feel a little validated in what I thought was going on behind closed doors and the way he reveals it. But the semantics of what we call this thing is ridiculous. A lot of the sort of nuance of things that actually just distract us from dealing with the challenge that is facing America and our Western allies from China is something we got to stop and just focus on the important stuff. So hopefully we can get there.
I agree, but I'm not sure that will go as smoothly as we might hope. Okay, there's been a lot going on with our friends across England's the pond across the Pacific, we'll say. And one of the stories I thought, and first we got issue correction. The last time we were on, we recorded on April Fool's Day, which we should have done better, but we didn't. And I talked about a story about the nuclear sub in China. Turns out they updated the story. It was a complete April Fool's joke. Thanks, Dave, for letting me know about that. Issue the correction. That is not true. So if you go listen to the podcast, which this show is a podcast, iTunes, Spotify, wherever you find podcasts, you will hear us talk about that. That turns out to be an April Fool's joke. And it's the last time we'll do a show on April Fool's Day. So lesson learned there.
Yeah, one of my favorite April Fools was our favorite, Bill Bishop and Cynicism. He put out an announcement that he had sold Cynicism to a company that was a state-owned enterprise in China. For a moment, I read that and I was like, oh my God, Bill got rich off his newsletter. But wait a minute, that's completely conflicted, and then I had to realize it was April 1, but I thought that was a really good one. Apparently, a lot of people really fell for it and he got a lot of crap for it. So he had to put out a statement afterwards saying, I'm not doing another April Fool's joke. So I guess when it comes to China, we should just all be extra careful about April Fool's Day, because with everything being stranger than fiction between the two countries and China and the rest of the world right now, it's almost impossible not to believe everything that we read. So let's avoid April 1st next year for sure.
There we go. Okay. Speaking of reading, you mentioned Josh Rogan's book. I haven't got to get into it yet, but you've been reading it. You said it makes you kind of feel some of the things that you were in your book you believe were going on. It's kind of validating. Let's kind of unpack that, because we are getting to a point now where we're starting to see the propaganda. It's starting to heat up. And so thinking about what is going on internally is important.
Yeah, well, Josh Rogan, as we know, is a columnist for the Washington Post and is really accomplished through 2 decades plus of journalism. He wrote this book called Chaos Under Heaven, which came out last month. I've been a little slow to getting around to reading it, but I'm loving it because there's certain things that are validating a lot of the ways I look at stuff. And what's interesting is I look at it from the practical and sort of executional side of the equation of the two superpowers colliding. I was in the middle of trying to be a cog in the wheel and helping in the cultural and commercial exchange. So my vantage point is one, he had the vantage point of what the insiders were saying and what they were telling him and what was going on behind closed doors in policy meetings. And it's really interesting. And one of the first things I'm just going to shout out about the book is that he, like me, felt like the China issue, because of Donald Trump, was polarized politically. And he felt like that was going to get us in a world of hurt and allow us never to fix the problem or address the problem in any sort of nationwide way, which when you look at China, they do everything as one message, one party, one people, whereas we're so bifurcated. What he's liking now, and I've been listening to some of his conversations recently about the book, is that it seems like there's a bipartisan consensus that China is a real issue. And we can dig in deeper on this. But as I've admitted on this show before, I am a nonpartisan patriot. I'm a nonpartisan populist. I have been a registered Democrat my whole life. You, on the other hand, are a libertarian. We try to handle this from a both red and blue perspective. And it really makes me feel good that others are feeling that we can actually address this on left-leaning platforms now. And I can tell you, I just did something with NPR. My op-ed that I wrote for American Thinker, I retooled and did a new edit and a longer version for Smerconish and CNN over spring break, which, by the way, occupied a few of my days. I suddenly have gotten calls from CNN and MSNBC. So that is fantastic, because this is something that we need to address as a nation. It cannot be polarized. And I love hearing Rogan talk about that.
Okay, well, let's talk about a story that I think encapsulates part of the China story, and that is Japan is wanting to put some of the Fukushima water into the sea. And China's
wait a minute. Before we go into Japan, let's talk. I want to talk about a couple of things that Rogan brings up in the book.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I agree with. And I'm curious if, I want to get your point of view. Okay. So I just wrote a bunch of them down. Okay. Number one is Shanghai. I was in Shanghai in election night 2016. Okay. That was the night that Trump sort of shocked the world and won the election. That next day, and actually that night, I was there with the Pac-12 for the Harvard-Stanford game. They play a Pac-12 game every year. In fact, the year after that was the one that was a little controversial because of the shoplifting incident. But it was really, really eye-opening to be on that side of the Pacific when something so historic went down. And the feeling that I got that day in November of 2016 was that something that was uncalculated just happened, right? There was nobody on the China side that saw that coming, and they were trying to recalibrate and readjust on how they were going to look to the United States. And what Rogan talks about in his book is all this prelude of the Obama administration trying to hand off to Hillary Clinton this sort of seamless transition on the US-China bilateral relationship and the promises that were made behind closed doors between US officials and Chinese officials to make it seamless, to address certain things. I mean, Josh is not blaming President Obama on anything or blaming any president, but there was this idea that everything was just going to move forward as predicted. And then suddenly Trump won, and cut to Josh Rogan somehow gets the complete scoop of what's going on inside Trump Towers in New York City a week later, when the foreign ministry shows up to talk about the US-China relationship with people like Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, the Mike Pompeo, and various other individuals. And it was quite a well-documented conversation, and it showed that everything changed over those 2 weeks. I'm curious what your feeling was when you were looking at the bilateral relationship after that election. Did you see something that was suddenly creating this massive amount of change moving forward?
Yeah, so when I think back, there's a couple of things that I think about from the Trump election. One, I had a friend, speaking of South Africa, who messaged me. He goes, "Oh my God, you guys just elected a racist." That's what he sent me. And I remember going, huh, okay. Now, I didn't think Trump was going to win, didn't vote for Trump, didn't vote for Hillary. And so I was just like, okay. And then I had someone else send me something pretty similar. And so it was kind of a shock to me to realize, okay, the international community, how they're perceiving this is one thing. Also, internally in the U.S., I thought Trump was going to get trounced. We were getting ready to move to Texas at the time. I told my wife, I said, listen, I'm going to watch until Hillary takes Florida, and then I'm going to go to bed, because once she takes Florida, it's over. And then Florida, and so we remember. So for me, it was a very much a day of reckoning, trying to figure out. Not that I had a dog in the hunt over, got hit vote for either one of them. You're just trying to understand what had happened. So I knew that a lot of things had changed, and I think the thing, looking back now with hindsight, is the prelude to this was Brexit. And I don't think many people, myself included, really took Brexit to heart and what it meant and the significance of it. And so I was in Africa when the first Brexit vote happened. And so I think, kind of as you go back and try to piece it together, there were so many moments that were there that we should have known more things were going on, and at least for me, I kind of missed them. And so during that time, I knew he was pretty. His rhetoric on China is pretty tough. I didn't know what he was going to do, because I didn't believe, my stance of Trump was, I didn't believe a lot of what he said. When we talk about tariffs and stuff, I didn't think he was going to do most of that stuff. So I thought it was a lot of talk trying to appeal to the right base, and then I thought he was going to move back left. So I didn't believe that he was going to do a lot of this stuff that he actually did, right, wrong, or indifferent. So that was kind of my read on it then, and looking back, that's what I would say.
Well, it's interesting because Josh, says that it's almost impossible or too simple to say that Trump had some master plan in regards to the US-China exchange. And then it's almost impossible or too simple to say he didn't have one. It was extremely wavering, and it was constantly conflicted because of the business interests between national security and the commerce and cultural and business exchange, right? It was constant warfare between those two. And what was interesting is that I remember the next day in Shanghai, I don't know if I've said it on this podcast before, but I had a meeting at Nike, and I went there, and it was interesting because I talked to a bunch of the Chinese executives there, and I said, well, what do you think of of Donald Trump winning the election? And they said, well, we're pretty excited about it. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Why is that? And he's like, well, and they said, well, because Hillary's sort of a hawk, and she's big into the military and everything. And Donald Trump's a deal maker. He wants to do business. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So when you look at how the CCP was trying to calculate that victory and how they were supposed to put together a new strategy and initiative moving forward, they probably were sort of betting on the fact that he was a businessman and was looking to make money for everybody and all his cronies, et cetera. They probably didn't think about the hawkishness that he had on the national security level, even though he was saying that in the election to win voters, right? They probably thought ultimately money was going to talk, right? So as we found out, it sort of did, it sort of didn't, and we wavered back and forth. It was sort of an interesting time, to say the least.
No, I think that's the thing. So, when Trump talks about some of the conservative points, going back to the 2016 election, I didn't really buy him. And, because he would say stuff like, we're going to build a wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. You're like, okay, yeah, good luck with that. And so he would say stuff and you're like, I don't, and so I think the thing that we all should probably take into consideration is, on some level, we don't trust our politicians, but they have a track record. Trump had no track record as far as a political. And so it was really hard to know what he was saying was true or not. And, he uses hyperbole and he lies, and, he's a deal maker and he's trying to negotiate. So it was, I think everyone, even the hardened Trump supporters, if they were honest today, they'd look back and say, yeah, we thought he was going to do this here and he really didn't, because there's a lot of things he didn't do and a lot of things he did do. And so how could you know that China was going to be really the issue that he pushed forward? Because a lot of his economic talk in the U.S., where he criticized Obama, he implemented a lot of similar policies. He criticized Obama for using the numbers to his advantage. Well, Trump did the same thing. So there's certain things like that that he did that you just couldn't pin him down. And so it's crazy. That was just 4 years ago, right?
I know. Well, and then on top of it, I think it was very interesting to watch how he pulled the alarm on China, right? Because that's one thing that I haven't gotten to the end of Josh's book, but it seems like his conclusion is going to be similar to mine, which is the best part about Donald Trump is he pulled the fire alarm about China and woke us up all to it. I mean, one amazing thing about Josh is he feels like he had his aha moment about the threat or the challenge China is going to be to the United States back in 2003. Cut to 16 years later, that's when I had mine. But it's interesting. I mean, he sort of says, hey, look, if you're going to credit anything, just credit the fact that we woke up to this China issue. And even better, if you look at Antony Blinken over the weekend, you know, you compare his statements to maybe past ones by Mike Pompeo, there's not a big difference. Like if you fell asleep 6 months ago and woke up today, you might actually think Donald Trump was still in the White House and our policy towards China has remained the status quo. We are taking a hard line in a lot of cases. And I think that is a legacy, whether you like him or not, of the former President Donald Trump. A couple of things I'm going to just gloss over and you cover the ones you want to cover and we'll get a discussion going. But other things that I picked up so far in the book, which really resonate with me and I agree with a lot. He says 100% we got to rebalance. He talks about how cross-border encroachment onto what everyday values and principles of Americans and national security interests and so on and so forth with our Western allies also has completely increased over time, and we got to push back on that. He talks about these cliches like Thucydides' trap, Cold War, and believes we need to try to avoid using them as sort of these presumed outcomes because he believes that there is this strategic competitor relationship we can have with China that avoids those, yet gets really serious about disrupting the relationship and creating a new balanced world between us and our Western allies and China. He also talks about, like, and Matt Pottinger does this a lot too, and so do I, the ticking clock. We're going to lose leverage in this relationship in a very short amount of time. I call it 2025. I think Matt does too. Josh hasn't given me a date yet in the book, but he's probably around there. He also talks a lot about like what we talk about which was the NBA issue, which really woke me up in 2019. He said it was really unfair to put NBA in that situation where they have to make a decision when the government itself of the United States was in the middle of creating a new trade dynamic with China and not backing them as a government, right? And I agree with that. Like, this is a lone wolf sacrificial lamb situation is not going to get us anywhere. We got to be united. He also talks about this reset and rebalance is going to be a very messy situation. It's going to require a lot of sacrifice. I've written op-eds about the fact we got to stop looking at stocks and their daily fluctuations and all this other stuff because it's expensive to move supply chains back to the United States or into allied countries. And it's very expensive to negotiate strong, heavy-handed trade negotiations where you got to take a hard line and possibly stop trade until you get that leverage to push things through. He also reiterated this conflict between national security interests, climate change interests. We know John Kerry's heading over there, and the business interests. We're seeing, obviously, the CCP push really hard, the business community, to try to placate all these issues and smooth them out so that things can continue as the status quo. And there's so much money on the line. That's a really difficult thing to overcome. And the one last thing I'll bring up is that the human rights issue, which I've said is sort of that fast moving train wreck. It's the thing that people can grab onto and say, okay, now I see why China's bad versus, oh, over the course of time, they're going to, remove the US dollar from reserve currency, or in the next 5 years, they're going to invade Taiwan. Human rights issues are like that fast moving train wreck that Americans can grab onto. It's something that can grab front page headlines. The photos capture attention. He agrees it's the same thing. And he says, rather than sort of the fast moving train wreck that Americans need to get their attention, he says it's more of a human rights issue that creates this non-political environment, right? Like, human rights is something that both sides of the table can agree on. So that's what is really forging the bipartisan consensus. I would argue that perhaps the public being involved and interested in what's going on in the human rights issue pushes the political environment to do things on a bipartisan basis. So anyway, a lot there. I'm curious if there's anything you want to hit on there.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you go to the NBA thing, or any of these issues, the U.S. and we talk about the back and forth of the parties, especially in energy, where you have these projects you're trying to get done, and then the new administration comes in and they cancel it, and then the next administration comes in and they're for it. The same thing is with our foreign policy, and one of the things is, and my stance on a lot of these issues is you just have to at least espouse what are the principles that you believe. And it feels like on the China stuff, we're trying to tackle China at their own game. And what I mean by that is China has a planned economy by and large. They're communist top down, which means that they're going to do things that are they're going to stun us. They're going to build these big cities, these big buildings. We're going, oh my gosh. And then they're going to just jack up all kinds of other stuff because that's what planned economies do. We look at that and we get envious. We're like, oh, wow, they're going to compete with us. Instead of saying, well, if this is me speaking here, I'm a free market capitalist. I think capitalism will destroy communism every time. The problem is we're trying to dip in the not the communist foot, but the socialist foot and not really be a free market because we think that's going to work. Well, that's their game. They're going to play that game better than us. And so we have to, if we want to play that game, that's fine. But we need to say that's the game we're playing, because where we're at in the U.S.-China relationship is, and this is why Trump was so effective, is that people know that something's wrong with it. Apart from human rights, they know that something's wrong with it. They know that their jobs are going over there. Now, they don't understand that maybe the minimum wage law and all that stuff and taxes are incentivizing that, but they know that there's something wrong. And what's happened is that the top of China and the top of the U.S., the political and business elites have worked together to make a lot of people rich, just not me and you. And so they know something's wrong, and so they're trying to figure that out. Well, when you start talking about these issues, we start saying, well, we want to fix them. Okay, how? We have to understand what are our principles. Are we free market? Where does that stop? And we don't have that in this country. And so that allows us to not get a lot done because we don't really fall back on what we believe. Well, with China, it's very much a collective mindset. They're trying to do the good for everyone. And the CCP is the one that kind of orchestrates that. And so, in the US, we say, well, we want to be a unified group. It's like, well, what do we want to be unified over? You talk about healthcare, you talk about energy, you talk about any of these issues. We don't really have a united front that we can rally around. So human rights, to your point, is the one thing we can't rally around. The problem is we want to compete with them. How do we compete with them when we don't know what kind of economy we actually want to have? And that's why we're going to struggle against them. Ultimately, communism cannot beat capitalism. It's just not possible. They can do great advances, they can do great things, but ultimately they can't. And so if we ever just stop and realize that, there's no threat. There is no threat. We can talk about the cybersecurity, all that stuff. There's just no threat because communism, go to the DMV, and that's communism on steroids. And so that's it. The DMV sucks because it's government ran. That's their economy. It looks great, but there's all kinds of problems. And you can talk about these ghost cities, these ghost towns, big buildings that are cracked that no one's living in. They've wasted billions of dollars on stuff that will never be used because it's a planned economy. And so right now we're like, oh my gosh, you're going to beat us with EVs. You're going to beat us with this. Well, they might beat us in part, but guess what? They're going to waste and ruin their economy on orders of magnitude because it's a planned economy. So if we want to tackle the China issue, we want to compete with them, let's compete as capitalists, not as trying to look towards to them and go, oh my God, we need more of what they've got. What they've got isn't working. It can't work because the law. I'll stop there. Let you respond.
Well, I mean, one of the things I'll say is that government has to incentivize the private sector to actually do what's on the best, with the best intentions of what's good for America. There's got to be good incentives there. I mean, if you look at the military industrial complex and the fact that I think the GOP wants a 16% increase in the budget going to the Pentagon, I really question if that's good spending there, right? Because let's face it, China does not want to go into a hot war, a kinetic war with us. So just building more of that infrastructure is just good money after bad in my feeling. And when I look at what Axios just put out today in regards to this bipartisan bill that's going to be on the Senate floor, I think April 21st, they have a bunch of subsidies or incentives for things that are pro-America in the U.S.-China conflict. But I look at it and I go, are you kidding me? They set aside $15 million, $15 million to help companies move supply chains out of China. And I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. But anyway, that is a bad subsidy that is, I think, well-intentioned, but way smaller than, say, the Chinese version of that. And what China's doing in terms of, say, the microchip industry moving towards 2025, they're probably spending lots of money in trying to incentivize companies. And I get it, they're state-owned enterprises or they're government-owned or whatever it is. But we really need to think about it. Like, if we're going to infiltrate capitalism in some aspects from the government, we got to be smart about it and put the money in the best places possible.
Apparently, Chris, I'll let you respond to this one.
People still use landlines at home. Oh, yes, that was a landline. Thank you. Yes, it is. And by the way, I think it's only spam that comes through. So anyway, my apologies, but I was on a rant and I didn't want to mute myself.
Oh, it was good. It was a good rant. Okay, so let me get your take on this. Janet Yellen came out last week, I believe, and said, hey, we want to have a global corporate tax. Okay, and so that is the kind of policy that so first off, let's just assume that China said that. We would lose our mind. We'd be like, you've lost your mind, first off. Second off, that is the type of policy that I'm exactly what I'm talking about. You're looking to China and say, how do we compete with China? Oh, we're going to try to make it to where we can tax people wherever they are, or the rate's the same wherever they are, so that maybe they'll stay here. Instead of just, I don't know, lowering the tax rate here. Because what will happen is, and we know this can happen, Chris, let's just say there's a 10% global tax rate or whatever it is. Well, China will just give some discount over here to offset it so that it's more competitive. And then Americans are still not getting the jobs and they're mad. And none of this stuff works. It just doesn't.
Okay, but I get it. You're coming at it from a libertarian point of view, and I'm totally with you. But here's the issue. There were a lot of major global companies that are based in the United States of America that paid zero taxes. So even if we lower it down to 5%, they're still going to find a way to pay zero taxes. Like, I would actually say, hey, what?
Quit trying to steer the market globally. It's not.
No, I know, but I would, you know what I would put up? I would say, hey, I don't know which Apple or whatever these ones are that aren't paying taxes. I would say, hey, look, go circumvent our tax system. But as far as using any of our roads for any of your delivery trucks or any of the infrastructure that's built by the federal government or the state government or anything that you need that is subsidized by taxpayers, you cannot use. You're going to be firewalled from that. So go ahead.
Paying taxes, that's not true. They pay Medicare, Social Security. They pay all kinds of taxes. You're talking about federal income taxes, but they don't pay. But they pay all kinds of taxes. And if they're on the road, they're putting gas in their car, and so they're paying the gas tax. They do pay taxes. This myth that these companies don't pay taxes is 100% verifiably not true. They don't pay a certain tax. But they do pay all kinds of other taxes, because when you have employees, you have by law to pay taxes. And so it's not as if they're not paying any tax. They're not paying federal income tax. And so if you want to debate whether or not they should be paying that, but all of their employees are paying federal income taxes, presumably, right? So we're like, we get tax jealous, and then we go print a gazillion dollars more than we're collecting taxes. And so,
well, you could argue. I mean, first of all, I don't want to get on the tax thing because we're getting away from China. And by the way, you could argue with modern monetary policy, like, why do we even have taxes? Because it just seems like we can print anything we want. Man United just commented that Biden's defense spending only $715 billion is 1% different than the GOP. I thought there was a 16% difference, but that might be right. Yes, libertarian. Anyway, the bottom line is, forget about taxes. Like, let's just talk about how we solve the issue of China and where we put resources and where we put brain power and intellect and policy and everything else as a nation, red and blue, and with our Western allies to deal with this issue, because we do have an issue. And by the way, over spring,
right? Lowering the tax bases to incentivize businesses to come back is part of that solution.
I think, but yes, it is 100%. But I also know it's a little bit out of my lane to get too much in the weeds on taxes.
And the only point I'm making with the tax thing is, instead of saying what is a free market solution, we look at what is more of a socialistic solution to try to solve it. And that's the only point I'm making, is that these China solutions, we look to what they would do and we try to clone that instead of saying, what is a free market solution, and try to implement that. If we believe the free market will beat them, then use the free market. Quit trying to dabble with Marx's ideas to beat China. That's not going to work.
Well, the other thing too is there's a direct moral consideration you got to give the developing countries who want to just catch up to us, which they probably won't in today's world, but they want to get as close as they can. And then they have every right to do all kinds of crazy stuff that we might have done early in our days to catch up to us. So like, who are we to say, no, you got to charge the same amount as we do? I mean, that's ridiculous. And then on top of it, what happens, and we saw it with Montenegro yesterday. I thought that was an interesting article. Suddenly Montenegro doesn't have the tax revenue to pay off the debts of this highway that they built that was loaned. The money was loaned by the Chinese government, and the European Union saying, screw you, Montenegro, we're not going to help bail you out. So guess what? Now, the highway system is essentially the collateral that's, taken over by the Chinese government because the debt is not paid. And that doesn't do us any good either.
Okay, so that's interesting because I look at that as a China liability, not a China asset. And so I look at their BRI stuff, and if they can't get their money back, that's an asset, not a liability, I think. And so, I mean, it's a liability, not an asset. And so I know if they get their teeth sunk in certain perspective, you should be concerned. But also there's plenty of times where they've just lost that money.
Well, let me ask you this. I've been reading a lot of this digital yuan stuff and hearing a lot of the commentators talk about it. And also Peter Thiel talking about how Bitcoin actually is playing right into the hands of China because it's sort of the enemy of your enemy. And the enemy of China is the US dollar as a reserve currency, right? So could China be thinking, hey, somewhere down the road, we're going to wipe out the US dollar as a reserve currency and be able to pursue our own modern monetary theory, which allows us to print money whenever we want? I don't know if that's what they're thinking. I don't know if they're actually capable of getting there, but it does seem like they're capable of getting the reserve currency of the dollar out of existence at some point down the road.
I want to write a small book on the digital yuan because I think that Bitcoin and the US dollar's reserve currency is the story moving forward, which is why some of these decisions we're making, when you push Iran away, and you can, whatever you think about the Iranians, I'm not saying that their leadership is good people, but when you push them away, you push them into the hands of the Chinese. And the Chinese are like, hey, guess what? We've got this currency. And oh, by the way, you're ruthless dictators like we are. We can track your people. Who wouldn't want that deal? So the digital yuan, I think, is something that you talk about a threat. And so how do you counter that? You don't counter that by keep pushing the Iranians away. You counter that by working with the Iranians and being more something that they want to work with. And so this whole policy of pushing people away and sanctioning them, you just push them into China's hands.
By the way, how crazy was that one article about the fact that they're going to have a digital yuan that has an expiration date on it? So if you don't spend it all, you actually don't have the value of the currency anymore in your, in whatever your bank account is. That's that's like forcing, that's super communist, right? Like you're forcing people to spend almost like what the Fed does with interest rates, but they're not at least forcing people. There's another comment. What do you think of Trump talking to Putin, Kim, and Chinese to avoid any escalation? Look, as far as I'm concerned, keeping conversation, dialogue between enemies is always a smart thing to do. I don't like the whole freeze out your enemies and don't talk to them. That only escalates things and it creates all kinds of suspicions and Thucydides traps by itself. So I actually, and look, I wasn't the biggest fan of Trump, but I thought it was actually smart for him to have open dialogues with our enemies. I don't know if he should have been saying these are great people and I really respect these people or whatever those, semantics were, but at least the dialogue was smart to have.
Yeah, I think going to North Korea, and at the time I said this and I'll stand by it, it didn't happen. If he were to get a legitimate deal with North Korea, he should have gotten a Nobel Peace Prize. So him going to North Korea, I thought was the right step. There's all this whole thing that we do as Americans as well, we endorse this or we don't endorse this. That's all propaganda, because when you look at what we actually do with foreign policy, we've talked about it on this show before. There's no consistent line that we draw. I wish we would open up with North Korea. We would try to, because those people are starving to death there. They're under the worst regime in the world, the people of North Korea. What we're doing is not working and will not work. Eventually, one day they'll have a violent revolution. But why would we not try to open up North Korea? Oh, by the way, that would put pressure on China if North Korea were to open back up, because that's kind of their little leverage point, right? They can get North Korea to fire off a ballistic missile here and do something there, and it's kind of like, it's just a little play toy. So why would we not open up with North Korea? I don't understand. Yeah, Kim Jong-un is a terrible person. He's a ruthless dictator. They are the worst regime in modern history by far. But their people are still starving. So we have to rethink these things. And again, because we're not working with them, who are they working with? The Chinese.
Yeah.
And the biggest threat in the world.
Well, they're like the little brother for sure. The little crazy brother that they are. It's probably a pain in the butt for Xi and his standing committee to deal with, but they're dealing with it, and they actually have that as an ally, and we don't. And, we'll see how that plays out. I feel like North Korea is the smallest part of our problems right now. We should probably wrap up.
Yep.
So that we have another great episode. I mean, we didn't even get to the Taiwan situation, which seems to get more and more flared up. I sent out a text wondering if people believe that they're going to make a move on Taiwan before the Beijing Olympics, which seems sort of crazy, but I don't know. It's a lot flaring up there. India and the Philippines, more flare-ups going there. Blinken, I thought, was really interesting on Meet the Press. CNBC, by the way, had a map the other day that had both Taiwan and China. I'm curious to see what happens with Comcast and Universal and everybody else involved with that one. And then, of course, there's our favorite Jack Ma, who still has not being seen and seems to have been kissing the ring quite often and has done everything possible to keep his business up and running, and stock markets seem to be okay with it.
And did In the Same Breath come out? That's this month, right?
In the Same Breath, I don't think it's come out yet. No, that's Warner Media. So HBO Max, but I did see Do Not Split over the holidays. I don't know if you've seen that yet, but that's the short film that's nominated for an Oscar, and that's worth seeing. So, and by the way, Oscars coming up. Curious to see what kind of stance any actors or filmmakers, producers take at that. And once again, China's firewalling that from getting into its community over there. So very interesting times, to say the least. There's going to be a lot to talk about on upcoming episodes. We really appreciate everybody tuning in today. It looks like we had a lot of comments that we didn't get to. We'll get to them on the next one, and we'll try to get out a little more warning when we do this, like we did this time, so we can get a lot of participation. So thank you.
Download the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Just type in Feeding the Dragon, and it will pop up there. If you can't get it, reach out to Chris at The Dragon Feeder or myself at Ryan Ray Sr. on Twitter. Be happy to help you guys out. And, oh, by the way, if you are listening to this podcast and you hit me up on Twitter, there is a paper that Bill Bishop on the Digital 2U1 that he included in his newsletter. It's for public consumption. And then he was a watcher on or overseer on. And so if you're interested in that, shoot me a DM on Twitter. I'll be sure to get you that, because it is kind of the best thing that I've seen on the topic so far. Mr. Fenton, it was good to be back. Got a little feisty today. That was fun. And we'll be back soon.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, everybody, for joining.